Well, hello, and welcome to my cellar. Here I am doing this again. I hate redoing these just because I don't feel the spontaneity. But in any event, I had another screw up with my audio, but it's working, so off we go. Last night, Friday, had a really, well, in fact, last week was great. Had four of my buddies over, and we played board games. And then Friday, some dear friends from Rhode Island came by, and another friend, and we had a lovely little outdoor on the porch sausage fest. And it's been nice to get back into human contact. Smearing peanut butter on an alligator's nose? Wow, Tim, your games get crazier than I imagined. That's nothing. In one of my Wheel of Blame games, they were confronted by a thorn wall that they couldn't figure out how to get to the other side of. And they noticed these giant butterflies that were sipping nectar out of these enormous bell-shaped flowers. So one of the players said, okay, I'm going to strip naked, and I'm going to pour nectar all over me. And then, to what end, I said. And he goes, well, the butterflies will see me, I'm covered in nectar, and they'll fly me over. I said, okay, let's give that a shot. Got a die roll that would indicate it worked. So, stark naked, covered in flower nectar, transported by giant butterflies. And we've probably done weirder things than that. If you want a name for a D&D City Guard campaign, how about Hill Giant Street Blues? It's not very euphonious, but clever. Tell us about your most memorable PC, if you wouldn't mind. Well, there's two. One was the one that introduced me to the game. I was given a 5th level dwarf, and a game this is the only second time I'd ever played, and the first one didn't last half an hour, and we were all dead. And he participated in this rescue in a dungeon in a prison, and saved this dying dwarf chieftain, high muckety muck, and was given the amulet of the badge of office, etc. So it's like, whoa, I just went from ordinary guy to the big house. So he was memorable. But as far as playing, it'd have to be Kelnor the Blue. He made a legitimate 12th level old school 12th level OD&D magic user, and he was pretty badass. Speaking to the Black Powder era skirmish games, Firelock Games has a pretty good Age of Piracy skirmish game called Blood and Thunder. It's 28 millimeter, and has rules for ship-to-ship, man-to-man, and ship-to-land battles. I've only got a chance to play it a few times at cons, and that was a while now, but I remember liking it. Okay, skirmish man-to-man with 28 millimeters, that's fine. I hope we're not dealing about 28 millimeter scale ships, because they would be bigger than a loaf of bread. And pretty expensive and heavier than hell to lug around, and nobody with significant other would stand for you buying 30 pounds of lead. Anyway, I understand where you're going. It's really not my bag. If I were to get into skirmish rules and skirmish games, they would be Dark Ages, Viking era, stuff like that. You know, Viking raids and things like that. That I would find much more appealing. The one I have from Warlord Games, Black Seas. Well, I've embarked on painting the ships. There's 9 of them. And as I told you before, they're not very big, and they're very tedious to paint. And I figure I'll probably have 30 to 35 hours into them before they're all fully painted and rigged and everything, maybe 40. So I hope that, The rules look very good. I have played out the rules on the table imaginarily, etc. The rule system looks very good. Though I gotta say, it's a pricey buy-in at $80 for 9 little plastic ship models and some rather poorly punched counters. And geez, guys, couldn't you throw in a few Ziplocs to put the counters in after they're all punched out? After we have to take nail clippers and clip all the little tips off the poorly punched out and carefully glue the couple that tore? I mean, golly, I've been doing this since long time. I mean, playing board games since 6th grade. I think I know how to punch out counters. These were not well done. And I gotta also say that the directions for assembling look like it's an exploded diagram with no sequencing, no nothing, just all the pieces, and here's where they go. Didn't care for that. Could have used some more examples of painting. Some of the color pictures could have been more varied. Other than that, though, it looks like it's going to be fun. 40 hours of painting from now. In regard to first level Illusionists, there is a first level Illusionist spell that is quite effective in combat against multiple opponents. Color Spray. More powerful than Magic Missile for a first level caster, similar in power to a sleep spell. It was in second AD&D, I'm not sure about earlier. I will grant you that Color Spray is a neat spell. However, it's not permanent, doesn't kill him, doesn't put him to sleep, and really, when you get down to it, it's rather limited. In effect, it's roll 6d10. Average roll on a d10 is 5.5. So you have 33, you can expect an average of 33 hit points. Well, if you're playing against four hit point orcs, that's one thing. But if you're playing against 3, 15, or 18 point something else's, it's not nearly as effective. I still say that low-level illusionists are just something that has to be mollycoddled and brought along and protected by the party because there's just isn't diddly they can do. Have you ever done time travel adventures with your players? Nah. That would involve getting into gunpowder if I go forward, from where I supposedly am. I'm fantasy, and the only travel type stuff I've ever done is I designed I can't remember if it was a short adventure or a room for the Tower of Gygax, but it involved these big tapestries that if you got too close to them, you got drawn into the battle that they were scenes of. And you had to figure out how to survive or you didn't come back out of the tapestry. But time travel itself, nah. Sending a party, a typically armed D&D party of 6 back to the Pleistocene would be pretty boring and pretty unbalanced. But that's just me. If you want to do time travel and go back and watch Joan of Arc being burned at the stake, or Attila turning away from Rome, or whatever, okay. Whatever floats your boat. I like keeping track of rations, water, and ammo because I enjoy the survival challenge aspect of games. Similarly, I enjoy the seaman movies. For example, post-apocalyptic movies. Example, post-nuclear war, zombie, pandemic, Mad Max. Survival. For example, The Descent. And historical movies about explorers when they ran out of supplies and had to ration things. And be creative about getting more food and water. And westerns like Young Guns, where the heroes are holed up in a house and shooting it out with enemies while their ammo is running out. I remember one of my friends wasn't into that and called me a rules lawyer. He preferred Lord of the Rings high-style fantasy, and I didn't. I find that feudalism was a happy system with pretty pure goody nobility versus irredeemably evil villains, difficult to believe. not immersive for me. I'm happy with a few supernatural other planar beings being pure good or pure evil, that is, angels, demons, undead, but I reckon that most beings can be persuaded somehow to come to an amicable peace, whether with a gift of food or other friendly gestures, and or by negotiating and offering outcomes where everyone is better off compared. With conflict, as well as the survival theme, I prefer low fantasy and pulp fantasy. For example, Conan, Solomon Kane, Indiana Jones, Game of Thrones, and even Gord the Rogue. Okay. I start to pay attention belatedly, admittedly, on purpose, admittedly. I start to pay attention to those things if it's a prolonged fight, if they're pinned down, if they're trying to wipe out a much larger party that they have pinned down. Then I start counting things like sling stones and arrows and what have you. As far as food, I assume that my player characters have iron rations. That's just something I assume. And I tell them at the beginning that you're assumed to have iron rations and rope and pitons and a hammer and, you know, everything, most anything except a 10-foot pole. Flask of oil. I don't care about that. Now, I will, if somebody's thrown, 5 or 6 flasks of oil, at that point go, no, I don't think so. You rummage around in your sack and you've thrown all your oil. And since this is how they hadn't written it down either, that ends it. Otherwise, I don't enjoy watching people starve to death. I've had parties holed up in the dungeon over a period of a couple, 3 days that want to know this thing they ate, can they kill it? Or this thing they killed, can they eat it? Without getting ill themselves. But hey, whatever is your style is your style, and it's what you like to do, and keep doing it. I'm just not into that granularity in most instances. Now, running a campaign or something of that nature, that may or may not play into it. City campaigns are off the chain. We got so much from the Waterdeep boxed set, the one with 10 maps and a dozen pages of possible encounters. Like I said, the options for creating things for the player characters to do are literally infinite in a big enough city. And when you want them to go out and trek through the countryside, you can always have some influential person from the countryside tell your boss, and so you guys are being sent to the countryside. Yeah, and so it really it knows no limitations. Underground, overland, urban. It's really it's a very fertile ground for adventuring and creating adventures and hooks. All right, now, as you might remember, last week I gave a shout out to Fat Dragon. Fat Dragon Games is excellent, is a reply here. Another reply, Tom is a good guy and his 3D models are great. They are. That's absolutely right. I understand he has a technique that he doesn't need supports inside and things, so they print very well. I don't have a printer. His videos are very helpful to my son when he bought a 3D printer. Yeah, Tom's a good teacher. I've had many people tell me that. So, for a guy who put the cur in Curmudgeon, that's pretty good. If I recall correctly, you don't award experience points for treasure. So, was the experience points for gold convention a Dave Arneson or Gary Gygax's innovation? If I had to, because I'll tell you right up front, I'm not sure. It was already in the game when I first played it in '74, and it was in the game when I went to work there in '75. If I had to guess, I would guess that Dave came up with the idea of, when you find a big haul, you ought to get a lot of credit for that. and Gary made up a chart. I don't use that metric. You find a big hoard, the finding of the hoard merits some points. Keeping track of what you kill merits points, and doing weird and great things merits points. But I first formed this irrational dislike of experience for gold when first playing in the original 3 little books, where everything was randomly generated, and because the dice said so, they just came across 16,000 gold pieces. Before I learned to create my own adventures in that, I was simply following the charts and tables. Dungeon creation by dice roll. So I thought that was silly. So I've not done it. I would imagine, again, so much of D&D can be divided, probably 60% of it can be divided into really neat ideas that Dave had that Gary codified. And the other 40% is somewhere in the middle where they got together and they exchanged ideas and, well, I think we could do it this way. What about handling it that? And that would be my guess. Dave was extremely good at coming up with interesting ideas, extremely poor at structuring, statting, implementing them. And I say this based on my experience with Blackmore. Gary was much more analytical, much more, well, he was a published board game author by that point, so he was used to combat tables and things of that nature, and so he had the more analytical mind in that regard. But again, that's surmise on my part. Material for constables, aka cops in D&D, maybe Barney Fife from the Andy Griffith Show. Well, yeah, if it's a constable your players are going to deal with, but I don't think many players go, yeah, I want to be Barney, and you can strap my sword in so I can't draw it and hurt myself. All right, other TV shows and movies about goofy cops. Reno 9/11, Paul Blart Mall Cop, and then a curious one about being goofy, and that's they've got Dragnet down. Now, maybe there might have been 2 versions. There might have been the original, and then they might have tried to revive it many years later, and it was a flop. But something I saw I watched the original Dragnet when they were new. All right, yes, I'm that old. Just as today, directors are trying to get things more realistic and more gritty, and of course a little more graphic. The producers and the directors back then didn't have that option. They certainly steered away from graphic violence, but they did try to portray cops how they thought cops should be portrayed. So, stiff, good old Jack Webb and his good old Harry Morgan sidekick, they were stiff, they were terse, right? That's the way cops should be. They're upholders of the law. And a lot of the Dragnet episodes, at least in the early ones, did a lot of preachy stuff. Webb got to do a lot of preachy lines. But people thought, they accepted that as what it should be or is be, not a word. Also, there's a TV series about medieval fantasy cops based on Pratchett's Discworld called The Watch. And there was, at least I'm going to try and find it because I'll watch anything about Discworld. All right, now we get into some deep philosophy. The Curmudgeon ponders deep thoughts now and again. What does it mean to play? What is playing? Those are good questions from previous episode. They got me interested in looking up some early definitions of play. Here's an interesting source I got from Wikipedia, and then nothing. So, something didn't transfer. All right, but I looked it up, and I looked it up in several sources, and roughly, they all concur that it's to engage in an activity for enjoyment or recreation rather than a serious or a practical purpose. So, I guess figure painters play when they're painting figures, just like they play when they're doing the game that the figures are for. You can play on a team. You can watch a great play over and over again on instant replay. But play is, we learn to play at a very early age, whether it's playing with our toes or fiddling with the leg of a stuffed animal in the crib, or or whatever. We learn to play at an early age. It gives us pleasure. And we're happy. So play's a good thing. Now, again, you have to strike a balance between play and reality, but play can be a good thing. It's very healthy, very therapeutic. Very therapeutic, pardon me. Okay, you've probably covered this many times before, but how important is it to track the passage of time in game? Gary seemed to think tracking time was very important based on his comments. All right. When? Time. All right, when? I'm a little loosey-goosey on counting the hours of daylight if we're traveling overland. I'm very precise if we're talking time in the combat round divided into 10 segments, how many segments it takes to do what you're trying to do, when you go in which segment, etc. There I'm very precise on. I'm a little loosey-goosey on overnight. In the adventures that I run, and especially in the modules that I wrote, if the party was to spend the night outdoors, when I ran games, I used to tell my party, okay, there's going to be 6 hours of night or 8 hours of night. Make watches. Do 2 4s, 4 2s, I don't care. Make out a watch roster. Write it out right now. Bed down for the night. And then as DM, I have the option to see whether or not anything does happen. If so, when? Automatically know who's on watch. And then I can just have them each for out of the blue, all right, roll a 20-sider, and we'll see how well they roll. And I'll take it from there. Gary was a big nut on time about healing. And that was an original tenet of the game. And that's why we had multiple player characters, because somebody was always healing up. And it's why I don't do training when you level up. I don't believe a fighter needs to go to a special school to become a 6th level fighter. I think by the time he achieves the points, it's pretty obvious to everybody that he's 6th level good. Skilled, adept, not capital G good. With a cleric, again, reminding, I don't treat clerics, what they do, as spells. I treat them as prayers. By the time they've earned enough experience to go up to another level, I assume that they have memorized all the prayers. It's kind of like passing a test to become a next level. So I'm loosey-goosey in the whole, in the gross, and I'm very precise in the minute. Travel time. I imagine Gary could have told you the number of days overland it would have taken you to get from any point on his Greyhawk world skill thing as to any other point. He'd know exactly how many days travel it was going to take. And That was his thing. Me, not so much. Now, here's the follow-up. Is this useful to the game or just picking gnat poop out of pepper? And to a follow-up to that, I don't know about you, but I prefer not to eat gnat poop with my pepper. Well, no, it's not picking gnat poop out of pepper. It all depends on how you function and structure your game. Now, for those of you who prefer not to, you would be appalled if you dig deep enough and find out the USDA's allowable bug parts per million or bug parts per pound. You eat bug parts all the time, especially in dry grain, especially in cereals. We've been eating them for decades and decades and decades. Gnat poop and pepper, I wouldn't worry about it. Unless they were malevolent gnats. Okay. Fatigue definitely counts as damage or hit points in my view. You know, hit points, that was a bad, for the concept trying to be explained, that was a really bad choice of words. Evasion points. Some newer designs use luck. The whole thing being how many times can you dodge the blow. Now we're going to go into some more on this later in a couple of questions down, some more aspects of this. You have boxers and fighters in real life that weaponize their cardio to make the opponent tired and unable to successfully defend. This is what comes to mind when you mentioned your example of how blocking a blow with a shield can still take HP. As HP is the tool we're using to measure a ton of combat nuance, it makes enough sense to me that cardio, fatigue, stamina, whatever you want to call it, is all wrapped into it as much as how many axe blows to the face can I take before I die. Bingo. Which is why various stats add hit points. As I recall, I know strength does. I know constitution does. I think dex does at certain levels. And I think that's as it should be in the overall concept of what hit points actually are. Tag Tim, what do you think of co-op RPGs? Me and my best friend discovered Ironsworn and switched to it from A&D and 2E. It's a game that lightens the creative load and we really dig it. Haven't played any other system in about a year now. The big problem sometimes with playing co-op is that it's too hard to come up with something when you're both tired from work and real life in general. Co-op RPGs make it a bit easier by providing specific information about rolling after rolling for an outcome. For example, rolling a strong hit while gathering information results in you discover information that aids you in your quest or your immediate goal. Feels better, much better for our tired brains than a simple success. Okay. To be quite frank, co-op RPGs were under my radar. So I went and looked at Ironsworn. Not my cup of tea. When I discovered multiplayer games, for a long time I didn't play two-player games, and then I realized why. It's because I enjoy, the more people involved, the more I enjoy it. Just me and one other person and myself playing, no, it just doesn't arouse any interest in me. But again, as I say, almost every episode, if you enjoy it, play it. Play it. I come from a totally different background. The first couple of games I played in Lake Geneva were at least 7 or 8 players at the table. When I took the game to Carbondale, some weekends, some Saturdays, I had 14 or 15 people show up wanting to play D&D in the early days. And so we did. I did, spur of spur of the moment, seat of my pants, I figured out techniques to do it. I have done it at conventions where I had an overabundance of people sign up or whatever. Or I just had a situation where I had to come up with something really fast because everybody at the table had already played everything at least one person at the table had played in virtually everything I brought. So, I like the large table. I like the fact that 6 people have a much better idea of tweaking on, oh, that's it, than 1 or 2 people do. The synergy of multiple ideas interweaving and bouncing off each other, I get a great bit of joy watching. I get a greater bit of joy listening, and will often single out, what was that you said? And make everybody in the party then turn, and lo and behold, it was a great idea. They talked over it. I brought it out. You can't have that with just 1 or 2 people. But again, that's my preference. Okay, this is from last week. I used the wrong terminology in my Illusionist question last week. What I'm making is a 1 to 3 session module, not an entire campaign. I completely agree it would be impossible to run a long-term campaign with illusion being at the center. You can only fool your players so long. In the book, it mentions in regards to many illusion spells that they must actively disbelieve the illusion to get a savings throw. The way I interpret that is the players have to say something that I can classify as skepticism of whatever I'm presenting to them, even have a shot at seeing through the magic. Is that in line with the intentions or the design, or do you handle it differently? All right, stop right there. That is the intention. Now, once again, players being players, they will take it to extremes. Like I described earlier, how after reading a Conan story, they found out that splashing alcohol in the eyes let them see through an illusion until their eye made all their eyes so red and puffy that they couldn't see anymore, and they had to go. They had to quit that day and go rest. They have to. Yes, you're right. They have to do something. Now, once that starts happening, I just believe that. Every time the group goes into a room, they're going to disbelieve everything. I disbelieve this, I disbelieve that. Then it's up to you to figure out how to deal with that with your group, depending upon the severity of the malady. Okay, going on. Trying to make this module being extremely fun for me as I try to figure out how to sell my illusions and mix in things that are real. In the case that they attempt to disbelieve a trap or monster that is actually there, what would you suggest a punishment for a character that does not believe an actual minotaur is swinging a club at his head? Dead. Or 2 points short from dead. You can disbelieve and still raise your shield. I almost want to render them defenseless, but that's pretty rough. Thanks as always. I'm going to look into joining the virtual con if I can make the time. Okay, virtual con. Oh, yes. I'm doing North Texas RPG Con in a couple of weeks. So going back to the question. Well, yeah, if you've established, now not the first room. Okay, in the first encounter, and they have no idea what's going on, then I let that imaginary axeman swing his illusionary axe and have it go clear through the character's body, ephemerally, ethereally, whatever, and just give him a 3 points of cold damage and a quick wake-up call that things might not be as they seem. To kill him outright, no. Now, having said that, especially if we're in a second or third session, and they've gotten lax, well, dead, or 2 points short of dead. And I don't care if they got 47 to begin with. If they're going to take an unguarded smack to the head, that's a lethal blow, especially swung by a minotaur. hit points, also close call points. That's a good one, close call. Or, and this is a little clunky, but the right idea, auto save versus death points. Yeah, it's an amorphous thing, but once you can kind of accept it and grok it and wrap your head around it, I think you'll see it's a pretty fair metric of abstracting something like sword fighting. I totally get that hit points are the ability to avoid the fatal blow, above and beyond some kind of definite physical injury. But it begs the question, how many hit points must be lost to get some kind of physical injury requiring first aid to stop bleeding or prevent a continuously sprained limb or broken bones from depreciating to uselessness, if any? Maybe in the midst of the battle, oh, here we go. Great idea here. Maybe in the middle of the battle, the medic character, usually the cleric, could administer first aid by shooting blooded darts that explode and splinter Keotum's ointment on the injured character. Okay. The idea of hit location and critical hits goes against the whole ethos of hit points that I've talked about twice earlier tonight. Also, not being knowledgeable about Keotum's ointment. Again, ointment is a topical, and a topical suggests hits, wounds. All right. Let's say we go that direction. Let's say in getting to you're getting your character to just 6th level, AD&D, 6th level. How many times do you estimate that you would have been actually hit? You got to figure out how many encounters, how many sessions, how many encounters, whatever. The point I'm getting at is scar tissue is not flexible. In the last 20 years, we've made enormous strides in the settings that most D&D is set in, this amorphous middle-aged thing. It's not. Scar tissue binds whatever it hits. Correctly applied surgery changes your body. Even when it's done right, to repair something worse, it changes. All those, okay, let's posit that it took you an average of 16 sessions to make 5th level, which would seem to me to be pretty generous kind of money hall runs, but we'll take that. And in that, there were an average of 5.5 encounters involving combat. So now you're looking at 80 some encounters involving combat, most of which you will have involved yourself in, and you would undoubtedly have suffered some hits. Every one of those hits is a cut or wound or scar. Pretty soon you're not going to be able to raise your arm any higher than this because of the scar tissue. You're not going to be able to walk in anything faster than a shuffle. So that's a good reason to abstract it. Jolly Blackburn has a great deal of fun in the nights at dinner table doing the opposite. Hey, I'm bleeding out over here. Oh, it took a crossbow bolt in the femoral artery. He does a great time doing the opposite of what I do. And he's not wrong and I'm not wrong, and he's not right and I'm not right. It's our way of playing. And his lampooning of the way some other people play. It's a slippery slope when you start getting into actual physical wounds, because if you're going to be that real, then you're going to have to bring in scar tissue. Let's posit of those encounters, 80 encounters, how many would you have likely received a hit of more than 8 points? We'll just take 8 as an arbitrary number. every one of those 8 points would be a serious cut if that's where you're going. And that means a huge, hideous scar, which means you just lost dexterity. And maybe you start losing constitution. I don't know. But that's why I don't do it that way. And shooting paintballs at the front row players with an ointment, while a novel idea, even going in another question or a follow-up, with a medic guild that would have a marksman slingshot proficiency for halflings and gnomes to deliver the doses of healing ointment by pelting the frontline party members in the fanny. Well, I don't know how the frontline party members are going to enjoy getting a paintball in a butt from 4 feet. I don't play ointment because ointment is topical. I play potion, drink, drink, drink. I've always treated potions like what is now considered 5-hour energy or Red Bull, a pick-me-up. And get some more energy. Just like this thing I'm drinking with the caffeine juiced up in it. That's the way my world works. I don't use ointments. Having said that, not for healing. There's ointments that make you invisible and ointments that render you hiding. And you can make lots of magical ointments. All right. Onward. Oh, here's a long one. In regard to miniatures and terrain on the cheap, I've never played much D&D with miniatures and always thought most of the miniatures with medieval fantasy characters were way overpriced until I discovered the bargains of the decent plastic ones on eBay. In my opinion, it is disappointing that little green and tan plastic modern warfare army men are always relatively dirt cheap, like $35 for $1 at the Dollar Tree right now, while the medieval fantasy characters cost way more money. A couple of reasons for that. Number one, I can tell you with my somewhat limited knowledge of casting, though I have cast. I don't claim to be a master caster. The fantasy figures you're describing require a much more complex mold. Those little green and tan guys are in standard poses that date back literally to right after the Second World War, except now some of them have boobs. But there's a much greater demand for army soldiers than there are knights and dragons. Knights and dragons are not only less in demand, they're also much more difficult to produce. Okay. The D&D gamers I met who played with minis seemed to like 2D battle mats where the game was no more exciting than a lame old 2D video game like Ultima 1-4, except way slower. That experience made me curious what a fun, organized, perfectly functional, spontaneous 3D perspective miniature game of D&D would entail. How could that happen on a budget? Many of us gamers don't have storage space for the fancy, high-detailed Fat Dragon games and Stefan Picorni's Dwarven Forge stuff, nor the time to make high-detailed pieces of art like that. So, here's some ideas about random 3D terrain and 3D structures you and your audience might like. Search engine key phrases: augmented reality sandbox, kinetic sand, DIY Play-Doh, Jenga blocks and Jenga bricks, etc. If a little bit of sandbox space at the DM's table is available with miniatures. Oh, if this one's not written well and really badly punctuated. With easy recyclability capable of disassembling and reassembling terrain and structure constructions materials like I listed, what could possibly go wrong? Okay, so here's the main question. Is it true you said your D&D game is now only theater of the mind, but you and most of your generation and slightly older founders, there are no older founders of TSR, were once strategic miniature battle simulation games of historical battles with 3D terrain for those miniatures? Well, yes, if you call terrain some styrofoam, vaguely oval, usually shaped pieces about that thick that have been sanded on the edges so that they're rounder, of varying sizes, piled on top of each other, and then a piece of green felt or green fabric laid over it, terrain, yeah, we did. You can't play miniatures battle on a flat table unless you're there were some ancient battles that took place on Gaugamela took place in a prepared battlefield. So yeah, we had terrain. We had levels of terrain. If it was a very tall hill, it was a 3-level hill, and you got farther vision and sometimes farther ability to shoot farther. However, why am I theater of the mind today? Because I was theater of the mind, and I'm not ashamed of this. I was theater of the mind the first time I played. I was sitting in the Horde Hall in Lake Geneva and asked to envision myself in this place with the flashing lights and the dials and all this stuff. And before I knew it, I envisioned myself sealed in some sort of block of gas-permeable lucite, hauled up before some amazing wall of lights and dials and levers and whatever, and lasered into little tiny blocks. Well, I dare you to try and make that with terrain. I didn't need it. I didn't need terrain to see the dying dwarven lord on the bridge, the thin stone bridge that we were fleeing across when I didn't need it then, and also it wasn't available. So we learned to play without it. When we played chainmail to resolve a big battle outdoors, yeah, we used terrain. When we played the chainmail-like games that were played, there was terrain. Some of it was very abstract. If we had a marsh, it didn't mean that we had a big thing with bulrushes sticking out of that. It meant usually we had a dark green piece of something laid down. It was a marsh, you can't go through it, or if I play theater of the mind now because I can play it in person, I can play it over the internet, and have been playing it over the internet with some success. If I'm at a con playing a game that isn't well, even if it is a Wheel of Blame and somebody gets into their duffel and pulls out their figure, their avatar, I'm fine. Put it on the table in front of you. That's great. I'm not against figures. We didn't have figures. There weren't any orcs or goblins or anything like that, and so we used different colored dice if we had to visually lay it out to be able to see it while we were training ourselves in the theater of the mind. Very seldom, if you're in a fight in one of my games, will you score off against the same opponent unless that opponent chooses to do so. Otherwise, everything's a big swirling, hacking, chopping mess, and everybody's moving around, and which of the monsters actually gets struck doesn't matter. I've got them all on my chart numbered. I got each of their hit points, and I just start, okay, that hit 6, that hit 4, whatever. And sometimes you'll kill 5 out of 7, and the other 2 haven't been touched. But that's the way I do it. I don't like the idea of random sandbox terrain, except when I do it. Except I don't have random terrain. When you're playing on the wheel, it's almost, well, it's usually outdoors, and as you're teleported or transferred to each new encounter, I describe it in as much detail as necessary. Okay, that's the last one. Now, as some of you may have noticed, some Japanese porno king, with stuck an ad on my wall. And it got a reply. Sex? No thanks. We play D&D. That goes back to so many of those stereotypes from the early days. But anyway, I haven't figured out how to get that idiot off, take that comment off, or I would have removed it by now. All right. June 2nd in here in Ohio, we're going to be having full stadiums, and some of the restrictions are lifting. Please, if you haven't gotten vaccinated yet, do it. Do it. It's not political, it's science. Politics has nothing to do with the science, and people that buy into that argument need to check the weights on their scale of balances. That didn't make much sense. They need to re-examine what they're doing. And I won't get any more political than that. I'm doing 3 games at Texas at 7 o'clock Central Daylight Time PM. And they're 4 to 7 players. If they aren't filled up yet, go find one and fill it up. I'm still running them online for private parties. $75 a pop for the event. I don't anywhere from 4 to 7 players. I'm really looking forward to going back to the cons, hopefully in the fall, and hope to see you all there. And until that time, I'll simply say, Dodata Govi.
Oh, hello. I'm still figuring out when this thing starts. Welcome to my cellar.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs. Still quite a feller, a curmudgeon in the cellar.
Last man around when the rates went down. Calling Gary in that Lake Geneva town. Hey Gary, it's an awful mess. Let me edit, we'll have success. D&D and Dragon Magazine.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite a feller, a curmudgeon in the cellar.
Magic missile, it's a mortar shell. Make it hit in the first level spell. Brought psionics to the game to attack that wizard's brain. ESR and fantasy, collection of micro armory. Titan with tramp under a tree, high as could be.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar.